Welcome to ASHRAE's Tech Hour. Today's subject, decarbonizing healthcare. Our speaker today is Walt Vernon, Chief Executive Officer of Mazzetti, located in San Francisco, California, a national program management, consulting, and engineering firm solving clients' most unique challenges in the built environment. Mr. Vernon holds electrical engineering and mathematics degrees from Vanderbilt University. He has 30 years of experience in the research, planning, and design of healthcare facilities, and is actively involved on committees that impact the codes and standards involved in the design of healthcare facilities, including ASHRAE's Standing Standards Project Committee 189.3.
Well, welcome to this ASHRAE Technical Hour on decarbonizing healthcare. My name is Walt Vernon. I am an electrical engineer, actually, and have been working in the area of healthcare, certainly for many decades, it feels like now, and lately, in particular, helping clients around the country to wrestle with this really difficult problem of how to decarbonize. I'm going to start today by just talking about a few framing issues and boundary issues that help, I think, center us. The topic of decarbonization is very broad. There's a lot to it, and we're not going to talk about all of it today. But I did want to sort of set a framework. For healthcare, of course, in many ways, healthcare buildings are not a lot different than other buildings, but they do have very significant differences. Among those are unique regulatory and process needs. I heard somebody once say that healthcare is the most heavily regulated industry other than nuclear power plants, and I'm not sure that it isn't more heavily regulated than that. And because in some ways, a healthcare building embodies almost every type of building space, whether it's retail or residential or cooking or dining or laboratory or education. All of these spaces are bundled into sort of a single, almost like a city. So when we do a healthcare building and we think about decarbonizing, we've got all of that to deal with. Now, in healthcare, when we think about decarbonization, organizational boundaries matter when we think about healthcare, because healthcare embodies a lot of different kinds of buildings. We immediately think about acute care hospitals, and that's what I'm mostly going to talk about today. But there are also issues around dialysis centers or nursing homes, all of which have unique twists and unique needs, particularly in this area of how we decarbonize. Obviously, in the area of decarbonization, there are different challenges associated with new buildings and existing buildings, both challenges and opportunities. And we'll try to hit on some of those today as we go through this. One of the questions always in thinking about decarbonization is, which gases are we talking about? Because healthcare in particular emits all kinds of gases that are beyond the ones recognized by the various international protocols on greenhouse gases. And so deciding which gases you are thinking about when we think about decarbonization is really important, because decarbonization, right, how you define your problem is going to help determine what the strategies might be. And then, of course, there's the issue of scope 1, 2, 3, which we'll talk about in a second. And even more important than that in some ways is which part of scope 1, 2, and 3 are we dealing with? So ASHRAE members tend to deal with what I guess I might frame as the facility management side of the business. I'm working with some other folks to put together some educational material, and this table looks at categories of emissions in scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And partly, I've got this one color-coded by the department responsible for managing it inside of a healthcare institution. And that organizational perspective from the healthcare client is extremely important in how we think about working with the client to help them to decarbonize. You'll see that in the scope 1, which really has to do with the combustion that we do on site. We have everything from combustion of natural gas to emissions from refrigerants, medical gas system leaks and exhaust. Those are the kinds of things that ASHRAE members tend to focus on. We also get emissions from things like the landscape equipment and the mobile equipment. Scope 2, of course, has to do with the emissions from purchased energy from offsite. And that is a huge element of the emissions profile, as we'll look at in just a second, for healthcare buildings. And then in Scope 3, obviously we're talking about the stuff, in a way, that healthcare consumes. It's much less about the energy and much more about the emissions embodied in stuff. And even in ASHRAE, we think about the embodied carbon, particularly in building products. And how does the ASHRAE member think about how to manage that as part of a decarbonization effort? Today, I am primarily going to focus on the Scope 1 and Scope 2, not so much on the Scope 3. ASHRAE has a lot of resource that they're developing, frankly, around the Scope 3 embodied carbon. And possibly we should do another tech hour on those topics at some point. I want to look at the breakdown of greenhouse gases in a healthcare facility. When we look at a typical facility, we know today that by far the vast bulk of a healthcare facility's greenhouse gas emissions are the purchased goods and services, the so-called Scope 3 emissions, right? And we as ASHRAE members often don't have a lot of control over those. And they are notoriously difficult to measure and to manage. And in large part, they are the purview of the supply chain people. And so if you are trying to help a healthcare organization to decarbonize, it is important to know which parts of decarbonization are you talking about, right? And when we focus on the building emissions, as you'll see in the pie chart that we've got here, the capital purchases are certainly a part of it, and that's a kind of Scope 3 emission that deals with the embodied carbon. But then we also have the natural gas, the medical gas, the purchase electricity. And you can see that we in the ASHRAE world, in a way, we are not that huge a percentage of the greenhouse gas emissions of a healthcare facility. And yet when we talk about decarbonizing, in many ways, we are the easiest slice of that decarbonization pie to manage and control. And so it really is imperative that we take a lead in making this decarbonization happen. So I want to talk for a minute about healthcare in the US relative to healthcare in the rest of the world when we think about this decarbonization question. As this scatter plot shows, the size of the circle is relative to the size of the spend in the economy on a particular thing. And you'll see we in the US, right, we have the biggest circle. We're also highest, right? So we have the highest emissions per capita from our healthcare system than any other country in the world. And for anybody who's doing work in the healthcare sector or who knows much about the healthcare sector, you will also know that the outcomes our healthcare system gets tend to be far worse than much of the rest of the industrial world. So we are spending a lot of carbon for not a lot of benefit. And what that means, I think, is there's a lot of potential for us in the US to improve our carbon footprint. That's some of the good news, because when we think about decarbonizing healthcare, particularly in the United States, it's devilishly difficult. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the factors that make decarbonizing difficult. I've included a site plan here for a typical hospital. This happens to be in Central California. This hospital, you can see, occupies a largely agricultural area. And this client came to us and they were interested in an energy strategy. They could have cared less about carbon. And when they came to us, they were asking, look, we have aging infrastructure. We are facing Wildfires. We are facing power outages from the utility who are trying to prevent wildfires. We are facing rising utility prices. We are facing risks from the state of California around the energy markets, around carbon emissions. We are trying to manage all this. And so we really want to focus on our resilience. How do we focus on our resilience? And by the way, they said, like most of healthcare, we're going out of business, right? We are having terrible economic times. So we need to find ways to improve our bottom line. And I think this kind of attitude is really typical of healthcare. They are resilience focused, they are bottom line focused. And so decarbonization is a distant third in a way in terms of their priorities. And so thinking about how to knit together a decarbonization or an energy strategy that helps them is really is tricky, but important. Healthcare, as you all know, is just emerging from the worst pandemic in the last 100 years. Healthcare really is dealing with these issues of resilience and how do we respond to a changing environment in all kinds of ways in different parts of the country. One of the challenges that we face in healthcare is that healthcare providers are notoriously risk averse. The quality movement in healthcare in some ways possibly exaggerates the emphasis on allowing no risk. And that shows up then in some of the building codes and some of the regulations and some of the things that make it harder for us as designers often to work on decarbonization. And the industry is really struggling financially. The COVID crisis in particular, in many ways, broke the financial back of the industry because there was so much uncompensated care. There was so much of the care that they make money at that wasn't available. And so the industry is really struggling to figure out, okay, we're having a hard enough time keeping the doors open, and you want us to worry about carbon? You must be kidding us, right? So, and yet it is an imperative, and we'll talk about how in a minute. I did want to talk about another challenge, which has to do with what I would call load growth. The table that I'm showing you now looks at a typical healthcare facility and their experience this was a facility that was working on decarbonization. And if you look at their business as usual trajectory, what you'll see is a steady increase, right? And the steady increase comes from a lot of factors, but primarily technology, and the technology that we continue to introduce into our buildings and that we as designers then have to deal with. And so this particular client was look at how could they do capital projects, how could they revise operations, how could they minimize behaviors, and those are some of the keys to making this happen, and we can talk about it a little bit. So I mentioned the issue of equipment. I want to talk about that equipment load because it's really terribly important when we think about healthcare loads. Some of you may remember a number of years ago, Kaiser Permanente ran a competition called the Small Hospital Big Idea Competition. And the notion was to try to envision the healthcare, that was really the hospital, the small hospital of the future. There was another project called Targeting 100 that was funded by the Department of Energy. And they had a very similar kind of a table, which looked at various parts of the healthcare load. And in all of these analysis, right, there are ways to figure out how to reduce processed steam, how to reduce domestic hot water, how to reduce our lighting. But what stays constant is this equipment load. And the equipment load has a double impact, right? Because it's consuming energy, but it is also generating heat that we then, as an ASHRAE community, have to remove from a space. So figuring out how we're going to deal with equipment is terribly important. And there are efforts now underway to start, Energy Star in particular is starting to look at how can we create Energy Star for medical equipment. And there are efforts underway to deal with that. That tends to be outside the purview of ASHRAE members, but I think there's an opportunity there for us to to start to play a role and to have conversations. And ASHRAE in particular does have a research project going on as we speak, looking at how can we measure that? How can we better organize our ASHRAE guidance around ventilating these spaces? Because our guidance today may be providing overventilation, overcooling in ways that are not helpful for decarbonization. So ASHRAE is already investing in some tools that should be available soon to help us with that particular part of the challenge. There are certain parts of the equipment load that are especially difficult, particularly sterilization. Kitchens, another difficult one, laundries. One of the interesting thing about some of these particular loads is that many healthcare organizations will contract these services out to some other entity and maybe even in another location. And when they do that, it does reduce the emissions for a particular building. But of course, all they've really done is exported those emissions, and they've turned them from a scope 1 or scope 2 into a scope 3. So that is, I suppose, a strategy, but something to be aware of. But there are strategies, particularly around kitchen, laundry, a little bit less today, but there are strategies around these. And one thing I will say about sterilization, I do a lot of work with the International Federation of Healthcare Engineers. And a couple of days ago, I did an interview with some award winners from South Africa. And these folks run hospitals in South Africa. And they were telling me about the fact that their hospitals are all electric. They don't use natural gas for anything. And I was asking them about sterilization. And of course, they use electric sterilization. So one of the things that I do think is possible for somebody like ASHRAE, who is a global society, is to learn those lessons from around the world, because ASHRAE is a global community. And just because we don't do it in the US and we develop these mental models that it isn't possible, I think we can learn how to do it from people around the world. I did want to talk about a concept called committed warming. This is from a scientific journal. And the notion of committed warming, this is one of the difficulties that we frequently run into in decarbonizing healthcare. You know, people will make the argument that climate change is going to impose tremendous costs and tremendous health costs on us as a species, right? And so therefore, it makes sense to invest in decarbonizing. And that's certainly true in a macro sense. The problem is, when you talk to a hospital CFO, they will say to you, yes, but even if I got to zero carbon, it isn't going to matter, right? Because the rest of the world. And there is this notion of committed warming, that even if all of us stopped all emissions today, things are going to get worse. They're going to get worse because these gases stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And so we as designers, we have to be planning for both mitigation as well as adaptation to this changing climate. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why healthcare is ready. I want to share with just a few perspectives about what's going on around the world. You are probably familiar with the United Nations and the IPCC and some of the international work in the climate change area. The United Nations is called Code Red for humanity because of the issue of the climate. And they have said that as a species, really, we've got to reduce our emissions 45% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. 45% by 2030 is a really scary number, because what that means is we cannot buy, collectively, any of us, one more thing that burns fossil fuels. We cannot buy one more thing, and we have to reduce our existing emissions 45% in the next 7 years. That is a tall order. And for every new thing we think we have to buy that consumes fossil fuels, that makes that 45% number deeper. We're digging the hole deeper, right? So it's a really, really difficult problem. The healthcare industry, however, is recognizing its responsibility and its opportunity, if you will, to lead in this critical area. In late 2021, the 200 leading healthcare journals these are the healthcare journals, right? The doctors, the nurses, the clinicians, they issued a joint call, the 200 from around the world, to world leaders to tackle the catastrophic harm of healthcare, of climate change. And among that call was to the healthcare industry itself to reduce its emissions. And I think that's highly significant, because we in the design community, we say that form follows function. And if the people that we are serving, right, the clinicians, are saying we've got to reduce our emissions, then we who have the privilege to design for them have the opportunity certainly to respond to that call. I want to talk about the International Hospital Federation. The International Hospital Federation represents the CEOs, the CFOs, the boards for healthcare organizations around the world. In the United States, the American College of Healthcare Executives, the American Hospital Association are all members of this organization. And the International Hospital Federation has now set up a Geneva Center for Healthcare Leadership and Sustainability. They are training healthcare leaders in how to lead in this issue of climate change and decarbonization. Those are the people, right? We in the design community, we've been begging for years for healthcare CEOs and leaders to pay attention to us and to this issue. And this is our moment, because the leaders know that it needs to be done, but they don't know how to do it. And so this is our opportunity to step up and deliver. You are probably familiar with the Health and Human Services of the United States. In late 2021, created a Health and Human Services climate pledge. Many hospitals, I think the number is up to 600 hospitals now, have joined this. And they have committed to reducing their emissions 50% by 2030. They don't know how to do it. They need us to help them. And so there's an opportunity here. The National Academy of Medicine. For those of you who don't know, the National Academy of Medicine was the group that did the study around the fact that we kill 100,000 people a year in preventable medical errors, and led to the whole notion of patient safety and how we do that better. Now, the National Academy of Medicine is calling on the healthcare community to reduce its carbon emissions. And they've created something that they call an action collaborative around decarbonizing the healthcare sector. And they have pulled together the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, most of the major healthcare organizations in the country, universities, think tanks, the Joint Commission. The CEO of the Joint Commission is now part of and trying to figure out, how does a Joint Commission work on decarbonization? We have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, a part of this effort, thinking about how do we bring together the leadership of all of the healthcare sector to tackle this dramatic problem, starting with walking the talk, right? How do we as a healthcare sector reduce our emissions? All right, so I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit less about why and a little bit more about how. I do want to start with a reflection on what I frame as the problem of stranded assets. Stranded assets has to do with the fact that when we make an investment in something, if the need for that thing goes away before we've sort of used its economic life, if you will, it makes it really difficult on the investor. I hear a lot from different ASHRAE members, it's cleaner for us to put in a natural gas system than an electric system because the electric grid is still not very clean. I think that's a real problem. And I think we as ASHRAE members need to really think about this perspective, because when we put in a boiler that's going to last for 30 years and consume methane and put carbon into the atmosphere, it's going to want to do that for the next 30 years because of this stranded asset problem. And so I think we really, as ASHRAE members, even if the grid changed around us, which it will, we're still going to want to burn natural gas in that boiler. And so I think we as an ASHRAE community need to not take the grid as a fixed emissions source, right? We need to make the assumption that the grid is going to get cleaner, and therefore we as designers, we have got to be putting in electric systems and not fossil fuel burning systems. That's a hard thing to do, but I think there's no choice. The other thing that a lot of healthcare organizations are doing today, of course, is to essentially buy indulgences, if you will. And so they're buying their way out of the problem, and they will say, well, it's too expensive to replace that boiler, so I'm going to buy offsets, carbon offsets. And there is increasing attention, of course, especially in the last COP meeting, Convention of the Parties, if you followed that, about the issue of greenwashing and the greenwashing through procurement of various environmental attributes, whether it's RECs or offsets and all the different qualities of those. And I do think that is it's a way to, certainly a way to greenwash. It's certainly a way, in theory, to make some difference. But I think as ASHRAE, we have the opportunity to save our clients money, because if we can help them reduce their emissions, then they don't have to buy these offsets and worry about the greenwash problem. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us here. And I think when we deal with clients, let's work with them to reduce their emissions and not encourage them to go buy offsets somewhere. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ASHRAE work already going on around building codes. There's this particular chart that I'm showing now looks at various iterations of some of the ASHRAE codes and some other entities and some other hospitals. This is all having to do with hospital energy consumption. And you can see that as we evolve from the 2004 ASHRAE 90.1 to the latest editions of ASHRAE 90.1, ASHRAE is doing a really good job of pushing down the emissions from a healthcare facility, if only we followed these requirements, right? The federal government in the EAP Act does require every state in the country to comply with the latest edition of ASHRAE 90.1. Most states either do not comply with that requirement or they don't enforce it. And so I do think there's an opportunity for us, again, here as ASHRAE members, to remind our clients that, look, this is the law, right? Even if it isn't necessarily enforced, I feel like we have a moral obligation to do the right thing. And again, ASHRAE has been there for us, and ASHRAE has created a pathway to a dramatically better building if we will simply follow that advice. So, and then if you'll see on the far right of this particular chart, you'll see some other hospitals in Europe that are achieving dramatically better emissions, even than 90.1 2020 is. So we know we can do better even than that. So the state of California, as many of you know, has very aggressive decarbonization standards. California is working very hard at greening its grid. One of the things I often hear is that California is going too fast, right? Because oftentimes they implement regulations and it doesn't work exactly perfectly. And yet I think they are helping to show the rest of us in some ways how to get this done. One of the things they're working on right now is a guidebook for how to decarbonize healthcare. And they focus there because healthcare is notoriously difficult for some of the reasons we talked about earlier to decarbonize. It was interesting. I was talking a few days ago to a friend of mine who's a doctor of entomology at Stanford University, and she won a Nobel Prize in 2004 for one of the first IPCC reports on the need to decarbonize in this world. And one of the things she was talking about is, IPCC is heavily focused on how do we decarbonize other sectors, because sectors like healthcare are impossible. And in fact, of course, I think healthcare isn't impossible. And the CEC guidebook is starting to provide pathways to actually doing that. And so I've got a little QR code here. You can go to this effort. The effort is sort of an ongoing effort as we speak. It is a crowdsourced effort. So it's trying to bring together the best thinking from around the country, around the world, funded by the California Energy Commission. Ultimately, this guidebook is not focused on the issue of fuel switching. So it is not focused on substituting electricity for natural gas. Instead, it is focused on how do we bring down consumption of natural gas in general, as sort of a prelude to, I suppose I would say, fuel switching. When you go to, there's a website up you can look at and participate in right now. There's a LinkedIn website, and many of the strategies that are fundamental to decarbonization are being discussed and chatted about in some of these things. So you can both learn and access these resources and be a part of the conversation as well. So I think it's an opportunity for ASHRAE members in many regards. The book is being organized into strategies that minimize reheat, reduce loads, strategies that focus on the central plant and how do we configure central plant systems to reduce emissions. How do we deal with domestic hot water? How do we deal with the problems of steam? How do we deal with load shifting and our load profiles? And how do we maximize energy storage? And so a wide range of strategies that can help us as designers to reduce our carbon footprint, both in new and in existing buildings. So I want to kind of talk through a little bit about what I might frame as some of the generic strategies for decarbonization. You know, when we talk about a traditional hospital design today, we are burning fuel for a lot of those equipment loads, whether it's kitchen, laundry, sterilization that we talked about. We are burning natural gas for heating needs, whether it's reheat in our systems, heating hot water, domestic hot water. We are burning gas today for humidification needs, for sterilization needs. We are burning diesel fuel typically, although sometimes natural gas to produce electricity in various forms. And so we're burning lots and lots of fuels for lots and lots of purposes, right? So as we start to think about how are we going to decarbonize, and one of the first things we have to focus on is let's reduce our consumption in all of these areas, right? And this is something that ASHRAE and its decarbonization task force is really focused on. How do we help our clients? How do we help our industry to really start to be more efficient? That's one of the sweet spots for ASHRAE historically, is reducing the demand for energy, because the more we can reduce, the less we have to worry about producing wherever it comes from. And certainly the cheapest decarbonization strategy is to turn things off, right? So our first move in decarbonization always has to be to figure out how do we minimize consumption at the outset. Once we've thought about how to minimize consumption, we then want to focus on issues of waste heat. There are many processes within healthcare where there's an opportunity to capture and reuse waste heat, often from generation of electricity. One of the new areas that some people are looking at is using new technologies for on-site waste disposal. Incineration, medical waste incineration, got a very bad name a few decades ago when medical waste incinerators were found to be mismanaged, not well operated, and really serious sources of very hazardous chemicals. And rightly so, many of these were shut down. But new generations of waste to energy systems allow us to not only not have to truck our waste far away someplace, but to keep it on site. And so we eliminate the transport, and to take that waste heat and use it in place of burning natural gas on our campus to generate heat for some of these needs. So this issue of waste heat can start to help us with some of the really difficult needs in decarbonization, particularly around humidification and sterilization. And then depending on where we are geographically, right, heat becomes the biggest decarbonization problem in a lot of geographies. And so figuring out how to maximize our use of waste heat is really, really critical to thinking about how we develop our future, again, whether it's an existing building or a new building. After we have thought about reducing our emissions and maximizing our recapture and reuse, if you will, of the waste heat, then we need to start thinking about electrification and taking the electricity and doing more generation on site where we can. Obviously taking the waste heat from that generation process where it exists and starting to electrify the loads in the building. That is going to be essential. One of the things that, and I'll talk about a little bit later, but one of the heavy influences here, and I guess you're lucky that I'm an electrical engineer so I can speak to this, because as we start to electrify, the regulations in the National Electrical Code start to kick in. And this is really important because one of the things we're starting to look at in the world of electrical engineering are the demand factors that we're using as we size systems. Because with today's designs, we tend to size our components larger than what the demand is that's needed. And so there's increasing attention and research money being focused on how do we improve the demand factors to be able to more closely tailor our electrical systems to the actual needs of the buildings. And so this is a rapidly developing world in all of these dimensions, right? Because even as we are trying to figure out how do we reduce consumption, how do we start to generate waste heat, how do we start to electrify, now we've got changing electrical codes to deal with, and it's really solving simultaneous equations. But we're engineers, so solving simultaneous equations is what we do. The issue of electrification does bring up, again, this issue of how dirty is the grid and how dirty are our sources of electricity. And here, I think one of the really exciting developments has to do with microgrids. And we're going to talk about that again in a minute. But the notion of starting to generate electricity on site to serve these loads and to start to think about using energy storage, both thermal energy storage as well as electrical energy storage, and starting to put together different combinations of energy generation, transformation, storage, pieces of equipment in new ways is really going to be fundamental to how we decarbonize our buildings. And here, this notion of the microgrid is incredibly important. And in some ways, you know, the idea of a microgrid is not especially new to us in healthcare. We've been doing on-site electricity generation for decades, right, with diesel generators. What is new is the new technologies that are available to us, the rapidly improving efficiencies and cost efficiencies of some of the generation sources, the rapidly improving analysis tools that will help us understand how to balance load profiles against generation profiles and storage ability versus weather events, and how do we put that together? And the computing power that we have available to us now is certainly incredibly important. Now, many of the emerging technologies, particularly fuel cells are an increasingly important part of most microgrids. And of course, they do run on methane today, which they crack internally and then use the hydrogen. So I personally believe that you know, a lot of people will argue that these fuel cells are not perfect because they're still consuming natural gas and they still have some emissions, and that is true. They are not perfect. And there's a couple of answers to that, one of which is there are renewable natural gas sources. That's a little bit like the offsets and environmental attributes, but we can generate electricity with renewable natural gas, capture the heat. That is certainly a way we could do it. The other thing about the fuel cells to me, though, is I think they're a bridging strategy, because these fuel cells, you know, tend to need to be replaced every decade or so. And as they are replaced, there's a lot of work going on in the area of hydrogen and how do we get to hydrogen fuel cells. Some of the recent federal money is being pumped heavily into how do we generate green hydrogen. A lot of controversy about hydrogen and green versus blue. But the other thing that's important to me as an electrical engineer is that the system architecture for my electrical system is going to be different if I use a set of fuel cells than if I use diesel generators, because the operating characteristics are different and the way they work with respect to the electrical distribution system is different. And so I think moving our clients to fuel cells now is going to set us up for a day when green hydrogen is available and hydrogen fuel cells are available. So that's clearly a part of our answer. And of course, then at the end of the day, we want to get rid of all of our sources of combustion, and voila, we're decarbonized from a building perspective. I do want to talk about money. One of the big challenges, of course, is how do we pay for all this stuff? And I remember when I was a young engineer, and we would analyze, right, this light fixture versus that light fixture. And we always looked at the utility as kind of a black box. And the cost was fixed. We knew what the cost of electricity was. So is this or that? What's the payback? Easy peasy. Today, that is no longer true. Today, when we think about engineering systems, the way that engineering systems work can be modified often. The way that we procure our energy supplies can be modified. The way that we contract for on-site versus off-site can be modified. And so we're not dealing with a fixed world anymore. When we think about the systems we design, we are thinking about a variable world. And so I increasingly think that we as designers, we have got to become more sophisticated in understanding the energy markets, the procurement markets, the financing structures, because often our designs have to be financial designs as well as technical designs, right? We've got to put together the right bundle of technologies and financing to be able to get to an optimal outcome. And in today's world, there are increasing number of opportunities to do that. In fact, because of the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we have a world of opportunities that we didn't have really even 6 weeks ago. I have to say I was a little late in recording this video, and I'm glad I was, because since I would volunteer to do it, and now the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and now we have some really amazing new tools that will help buy down the cost of a lot of the technologies that we need for this decarbonization process. And when we couple the IRA with utility grants, state grants, and then, thinking about one of the things that many healthcare institutions are doing now is they are arbitraging their environmental attributes. So stick with me a minute here for a little bit of finance. But if I generate electricity on my hospital from a solar panel, I have what's called a renewable energy credit. I can sell that renewable energy credit to somebody else and buy a cheaper offset. And I can use that cost difference to help me invest in more decarbonization projects. So again, I put it to you that thinking about the financing world in which we operate is an increasingly important part of how we design the technical systems that we design. All right, I want to talk a little bit about sort of evolution of codes, and then I'm going to switch a little bit to some more on microgrids. I was honored to be asked to help write the infectious aerosols position document for ASHRAE. This was recently published, the most recent edition. And one of the things we did in the infectious aerosols position document was to apply a way of thinking called evidence-based medicine, really. The notion here was, if we are thinking about ventilation as a way to prevent transmission of disease, then we are essentially saying ventilation is a medical intervention. And if we're thinking about ventilation as a medical intervention, it's fair to compare it against other potential medical interventions and to do it in a way that medical people and public health people and epidemiologists do as they think about different interventions to manage health conditions. And so the infectious aerosols position document, in a very long appendix, tries to look at various ways of dealing with reduction of risk from airborne transmission, or in this case, we're really talking about aerosolized. We're not using the word airborne anymore, so apologies to my aerosolized colleagues. But how do we think about ventilation compared to masking or cleaning or barriers or distancing or vaccination even, right? And so what we did is we looked at how much evidence is there for each intervention and how much benefit is there for each intervention and how much cost is there for each intervention. And in evidence-based medicine, they talk about what are side effects from a particular intervention. And our side effects are energy consumption and carbon emissions. And so really for the first time, and it was partly because of ASHRAE's new and very strong stance on the issue of decarbonization, we tried to bring carbon into our thinking about ventilation. And so we tried to think about how do we create bundles of strategies, not just thinking ventilation was the only answer, but ventilation in combination with a range of other strategies to optimize the benefit while minimizing our carbon. And I think this model is really, really important for the way we think about regulation and even design moving forward. So much of our regulation and design is somewhat of a line drawing problem, right? Is it 6 air changes or is it 4? And thinking about this in a way that helps to start to balance some of these factors, I think is going to be really, really critical to us as a profession and as we try to tackle this decarbonization question, because our regulations, particularly around ventilation, can drive a fair amount of the energy consumption and carbon emissions of a hospital. So I'm going to talk for a second about the National Electrical Code again. I talked earlier about the issue of demand factors. The 2023 National Electrical Code, which has just been published and is now available online and actually even in hard copy now, has an entirely new section on microgrids. And this is really game changing. And although it's in the National Electrical Code, I believe it's an opportunity for all ASHRAE members, because what we're saying now in the NEC is that we can use a microgrid composed of any combination of generation, storage, transformation, assets to provide energy to a facility. And clearly, you know, we can think about generators, we can think about PV panels, but certainly at least storage, right, is certainly an opportunity for a lot of ASHRAE members who deal with thermal loads. And so I believe there's a really important opportunity for us as an industry of electrical and mechanical engineers to really start to come together and put together those magic solutions that can make 1 + 1 equals not just 3, but maybe 10, and really start to get us towards decarbonization. So the idea of a microgrid, of course, is that in the old days, we had a utility, we had a diesel generator when the utility failed, and that was it. It was essentially a step function for each of the two sources. Today, what we're thinking about is we have this wide range of potential sources, we have a wide range of potential storage, and we have a wide range of loads. And so now we as electrical engineers are starting to think about how do we best optimize these combinations, including thermal energy storage and including waste heat from the electrical systems into the thermal systems, and including how does that interact with the grid, and how does that interact with finance, and how does that interact with the load profiles. So I think there's a whole new opportunity for us as engineers to really be engineers and not just follow the code books anymore, but to really use our creativity and our problem-solving skills to optimize these new systems in service of decarbonization. California Energy Commission, again, has funded 2 microgrid demonstration projects, right? This is one of the things I always hear is, well, it's a great idea, but who's done it, right? Healthcare will say, we don't really want to be on the bleeding edge. We might want to be on leading, but not bleeding. Well, somebody's got to do the bleeding in some ways, right? Somebody's got to do the experiments. So the California Energy Commission funded a demonstration project at the Kaiser Richmond Hospital. It's shown here in this picture. It's basically a solar array. There is a large battery bank in the first floor of this particular parking structure that serves the life safety branch of this particular hospital. It intervenes between the generators and the loads so that the generators never need to come on. This microgrid is taking the place essentially of that diesel generator with no emissions. And unlike the diesel generator that only operates during an emergency, this microgrid is operating all the time. And because it's operating all the time, you know, we are used as engineers to thinking about normal power and emergency power. But what does it mean when our emergency generation source is operating all the time? Is it normal? Is it emergency? Who cares? That's kind of what the new National Electrical Code is doing, is saying, look, what we want is a range of energy sources that provide the energy that we need to the loads that we need with the reliability that we need. Now, you engineers figure out how to get it done. And this is a demonstration project that is starting to show that it can be done. You're all familiar, of course, with the load profiles in buildings. This is some of the load profiles for this particular hospital. And when you think about microgrids today, and this is, again, one of the challenges for us as engineers, right? Different generation sources have different profiles in terms of how and when they generate and consume electricity, especially relative to the load demand. And so part of what we have to do as engineers is start to learn how to model and optimize and design and commission these systems so that they work, so that we put together something like a fuel cell, which has a very flat kind of a load generation profile, or the solar, which has that really peaky load generation profile. And then we use something like the batteries, the green here on this chart, to start to act as a damper or a shock absorber in some ways to even that out and better match it to the load. So there's so much opportunity for us as engineers to really do this well, and then to take the heat off of that to reduce the load further. So the opportunities for us are huge. I want to talk about another microgrid briefly that is currently under construction. So again, the California Energy Commission, you know, they are really keen to tackle the industries where it is hard, because where it's easy, you know, it's easy. And so they're trying to put their money into industries like healthcare where it's hard. And so they've got another microgrid design going on. This particular microgrid is another Kaiser Permanente hospital in Ontario, California. This one will use a combination of fuel cells, batteries, photovoltaics, and it will take the place of all of the diesel generators serving all of the emergency loads of the hospital. And in so doing, it will reduce the operating cost of this hospital, it will improve the resilience, and it will dramatically improve the load, the environmental footprint of the building. So going back to that Health and Human Services pledge about reducing our footprint 50% by 2030, this project is going to do it for this hospital. And just like they can do it, so can the rest of us, right? And so there are all of those opportunities we just talked about, and certainly we can do it. And what's really magical, and I hope everybody is aware of, again, the Inflation Reduction Act that was recently passed by Congress, and the opportunities that creates for us in both energy savings, because they've expanded the 179D energy saving credits, the areas of renewable generation, the area of storage, including thermal storage, the area of microgrid controllers. They've extended these incentives for 10 years. And they've made it available to not-for-profits through direct payments, which has never been in place before, right? All the incentives in the past have been around how do we use tax incentives, but most healthcare is not taxed. So it did no good and it didn't create the incentives. Now with the IRA, we can do this throughout healthcare. And we as engineers, we can help our clients access this money and make exciting projects happen. So, I started with, in some ways, why is it hard to do this in healthcare? Because it is hard. It is difficult. My friend, the Nobel laureate, said she has to work on other areas because healthcare is too hard, right? But there's an old Chinese proverb that says, when it's dark outside, you can curse the darkness or you can light a candle. And one of the things that I think we as ASHRAE members have the opportunity to do is to be lighters of candles in this world. And we can make this difference. We can make it happen. And I hope all of you will go do so. So thank you for the time and thank you for your attention.